you, has been our vice chairman of our Board of Trustees for a number of years, and he'll introduce our guest.
Thank you, Frank. Frank literally just came from overseas trip from Saudi Arabia, so he literally just came from the airport right straight here. Maybe we'll have him our next speaker. Your Excellency, distinguished guests. In July 2002, Daniel Ayalon assumed the position of Israel's ambassador to the United States. The ambassador has played an instrumental role in Israel's foreign policy during the last 3 consecutive Israeli administrations. Prior to his appointment as ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Ayalon was the foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. From 1997 to 2001, Ambassador Ayalon was the deputy foreign minister advisor to former Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Benjamin Netanyahu, during which he was a member of Israel's delegation to the Sharm el-Sheikh, 1997, White Plantation, 1998, and the Camp David in 2000 summits. Ambassador Ayalon served in New York from 1993 to 1997 as the director of the Bureau of Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, at which time he was a member of Israel's delegation to the United Nations and Israel representative of the General Assembly's Committee for Peacekeeping Operations and the United Nations Development Fund, the UNDP. As a professional Foreign Service diplomat, Ambassador Ayalon's previous diplomatic missions abroad have included Panama, where he was responsible for political, economic, media, and cultural ties between Panama and Israel. Ambassador Ayalon, born in 1956, is a native of Tel Aviv, a graduate of Tel Aviv University Economic Department, and holds an MBA from the University of Bowling Green in Ohio. Ambassador Ayalon is joined in Washington by his wife Anne and 2 children. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Ayalon to the Council.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you very much, Mr. Elias Shamali, for this kind introduction, which I wrote. And in fact, it was too kind because you made me younger than I am. I was born in 55, not 56, but thank you for the compliment. It is a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank Frank Bird and the entire Baltimore Council of Foreign Affairs for the invitation to be here with you tonight. Also, I can tell you in DC that the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs has a great reputation of a distinguished organization. Although it was founded only in 1980, it had made an indelible mark and distinguished achievements in educating the people of Baltimore on matters of foreign affairs. And again, I would like to thank you very much for including me in your programs. It also is a privilege to be here in Baltimore, a beautiful city which I try to frequent as much as I can. And I can tell you from the vantage point of being in DC, we are in DC quite proud to be so proximate to Baltimore. Now, you know, Israel has a special relationship with the United States, and but also an extremely unique relationship with Baltimore. Just downstairs from here in the harbor, the ship Exodus was rebuilt and outfitted here in the Baltimore harbor in 1947 before it set sail to take Jewish Holocaust refugees from France to pre-state Israel. While ultimately the Exodus never made it to its destination due to the British mandate unwillingness to allow Jewish immigrations, the tragic event made the world aware of the plight of Jewish refugees and created much sympathy for our cause. And although these people of broken spirit and broken bodies from the Holocaust, this particular group could not find a home right there. Right now, we are in a situation that Israel is a home for every Jewish people, and they all have a right to be back in their homeland. Now, if there is one message I would like to leave you here with, and later I'm glad the program includes some questions, because this is actually the best part of the program, is to also hear you and address some of your questions, inquiries, and concerns. The one message I would like to leave here with you is that Israel wants and desires peace. For us in Israel, peace is not just a strategic choice, but it's a moral obligation. And we are willing to make great concessions to have a genuine, durable peace. I think we have proven it in the past more than once. In the case of Egypt, when we had Prime Minister Begin sign the peace treaty with late President Sadat. In the case of Jordan, 1995, we have a full peace treaty with Jordan. And in these two cases, I can tell you, both Jordan and Egypt were bitter enemies with really bloody battles between the two countries. But there was one major factor. Once the leaders of these countries decided to go on the path to peace, they have relinquished all terror and violence activities. And I can tell you, both during the negotiations with Egypt, which lasted more than 3 years, from 78 to 1981, that's last century, and also with Jordan. They were very, very tough negotiations. And on many turns, a lot of times they were on brink of collapse. But never any side resorted to violence. Not a shot was exchanged, not a fire was created along the borders, whether it's the case of Egypt or with Jordan. And finally, we settled all the disputes around the negotiating table. And Israel went, as you know, far with great concessions to have this peace coming. And in retrospect now, we have celebrated just last March, now 25 years of the peace treaty with Egypt. It endures the time. With the same kind of spirit, the same kind of expectations, we approached the Palestinians. If you recall, in the Oslo process that started in '93, there was a major commitment. And I can tell you that late Prime Minister Rabin did not want to go along this path before he had a commitment, a written commitment by Arafat. And there is a famous letter of Arafat to Rabin, 9th September 1993, whereby the Palestinians committed not just to renounce terrorism, but never to resort to terror, and to solve all disputes between us peacefully around the negotiating table. And with this commitment, we went into the Oslo Agreement. There were a lot of concessions that we had to give. You know, we gave a lot of tangible assets, and we received paper commitments, which was fine with us because we wanted to trust our partners. Within these commitments, as I mentioned, the Palestinians took upon themselves to stop terror. It made only sense when they made the demand, and we accepted, that they would have a security and police force well armed, well equipped. We allowed that. The Oslo Accord was signed on the south lawn of the White House, September 13th, 1993. Few months later, Arafat, with almost 100,000 people of his troops, came over for the first time to the territories, and they were well equipped, as I mentioned, with arms in order to fight terror. On top of that, they received right from the beginning a 42% of the land, which was, in a way, a first installment. But the important issue here to mention is that 99% of all Palestinian population were living in this 42%, that thereby having them full control, I will say almost full sovereignty over their people. And they were managing their own affair as we could continue negotiating for a final statement solution. Also, we have allowed an international recognition for them, and we encourage that. And also, we have allowed really massive economic assistance. And I can tell you from 1993 on, until last year, more than $5 billion of foreign aid, including American money, Israeli money, European and others, Japanese, was given to the Palestinian Authority. Per capita, it's more than the Marshall Plan, than the Europeans received in the Marshall Plan following World War II. So when we look now back at the story of the Oslo process, certainly from Israeli perspective, it's a story of, I would say, of squander, almost of betrayal. Because these arms that we allowed the Palestinians to bring in to fight terror, not only they were not used to stop any terrorist, they were used against us. And in the last almost 4 years, what is called the Intifada. Intifada is really a misnomer. It suggests a popular uprising. This is not the case. And we have all the intelligence to prove, and I think we have proven it, that it was a top-down campaign of terror, premeditated, pre-planned, and carried out by this Palestinian leadership. So, as I mentioned, the weapons were turned against us. All this great assistance in economic resources were squandered. You don't see one refugee in the Palestinian territory which was rehabilitated. You don't see any infrastructure built, no factories, no sewage taken care of, no clinics. Where is all this money? If you look at the Forbes, just 6 months ago, Forbes published, you know, the Forbes magazine, published the richest foreign leaders in the world. Arafat is right there at the top 6. So it went there, and also to finance terror. So they squandered the economic funds, certainly on the military, but what really they squandered is Israeli trust. And this is the major problem that we face right now. We did lose faith and trust in this current leadership. And it was a great predecessor of mine, Abba Ibn, who said that the Palestinians never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. A great opportunity came in Camp David 2000, the summit with former President Clinton, Arafat, and former Prime Minister Barak, who was going a long way to create, for the first time in history, and I repeat, for the first time in history, a independent Palestinian state. I would say almost all what they wanted, about 97% of the land, everything they wanted. And here I can tell you that Israel, and I don't know of many other people or countries who give up voluntarily parts of their homeland for peace, and all that without ever losing a war. Now, the territories certainly are under dispute. If you look at the Palestinian narrative, it's certainly much different than ours. But what I'm telling my Palestinian interlocutors, don't talk to me about the past, because we will never agree on the past. You know what? Each people has a right to its own past. I'm not going to tell them what to think, what to dream about, what national ambitions to have, as I expect from them not to tell me about my traditions, about my heritage, about my sacred faith, my beliefs. But certainly, both our interests, the Palestinians and the Israelis, is to find a pragmatic solution. And here comes the role of leadership. Leadership really has to find or to bridge the gap between the nationalistic dreams and aspirations that all of us are entitled to their reality, which means concessions. You give some, we give some. Now, we were ready to meet them not halfway, but I would say almost all the way, where I mentioned that Prime Minister Barak was willing to give up 97% of all the land and create a Palestinian state for the first time, an independent one. But not only this offer was rejected, but then this violence started right after Camp David. I can tell you here, and I'm sure that all the negotiators in Camp David would agree. Everything was handed to Arafat on a silver platter, and he threw it in our hands. Now, this is a direct quote from President Clinton, as he felt right after the Arafat rejecting his plan. Now, as I mentioned, this year we celebrate the 25th anniversary of Camp David, the successful Camp David back in '78 with the peace with Egypt. And I was asked around the country many times, what is the difference? Why Camp David '78 succeeded where Camp David 2000 failed? And I would say that the crux, the main reason is leaders and leadership. And I'll give you an example. Back in 1978, 79, when Sadat signed the peace treaty, he did it prevailing over the judgment of his advisors. Some of his advisors, for instance, the then Prime Minister of Egypt, Fahmy, Ismail Fahmy, resigned in protest. But Sadat decided to take a leader's decision, to sign, against the judgment of his advisors. Camp David 2000, with Arafat, it was the same process, but in reverse. All of Arafat's advisors begged him, beseeched him to sign, and he wouldn't sign. So, if you want to know, this is the problem right there in a nutshell. Now, since this failed Camp David negotiations, we've suffered more than 21,000 terror attacks. We face a coalition of terrorists whereby Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Tanzim, which answerable to Arafat, and many other terror organizations all coalesced together. And 21,000 attacks, this is more than any one country can really take. It cost us 1,000 Israeli casualties, dead, and more than 6,000 injured. Now, Israel is a small country in proportion to the United States population. 1,000 Israeli dead, if I translate it to the size of the American population, it would be like 50,000 Americans. Just think how this country would feel and react to 50,000 American dead over three and a half year period because of terror activities, or 6,000 injuries, which is more than 250,000 injured. It's very, very difficult. We realized that we are in an all-out war, that the terror has waged an all-out war on us, and we had to respond. And I can tell you, it wasn't until March, the end of March of 2002, that we decided to go after the terrorists in their home base, because we tried to give the Palestinians, including Arafat, time and again, chances to do what they need to do, according to all the commitments they took upon themselves to stop the terror. I talked about missed opportunities. Camp David was one. Let me tell you about another one, which was right after Sharon was elected in 2001. And he made 2 phone calls to Arafat after he was elected, still trying to give Arafat a chance. Stop the terror, stop the incitement, stop the violence, let's talk. But the answers kept coming in more Israeli bodies and children who were just brutally assassinated. The latest brutal event at that time came on Passover of 2002. Now, there were different and various efforts to negotiate. Sometimes I hear that, well, the international community maybe was not involved enough. Doesn't add up. If you look, there was the Mitchell report in 2001. Then, director of the CIA, George Tenet, was sent to the area in June 2001. Just think that he spent the better part of June 2001 trying to negotiate and create a plan for the Palestinians to stop the terror, only 3 months before 9/11. And then there was General Zinni, who was sent as a special envoy. And I can tell you, I had the privilege to work both with the Director Tenet and General Zinni when I was in my former position working for Prime Minister Sharon. And I can tell you, when General Zinni was selected for the job, there was some kind of derision in the area. They said, well, what does he know about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? He doesn't know anything. He's not experienced on this issue. Who are they sending? Well, I can tell you, in retrospect, he was one of the best envoys. And I say, how do I sum his mission? I say, he came, he saw, and he reported. And he's a professional soldier, he's a decent guy, he saw what the problem is and he reported it. And the gist of General Zinni's plan was that it's not just enough to have a ceasefire with the terrorists. You have to neutralize their capabilities. He came up with a plan. And the plan was to dismantle Palestinian terror organizations and for Israel to withdraw its forces to the line of the pre-violence, 28th of September 2000. I remember a very long and tough meeting with him at the Prime Minister's office, where he presented to the Prime Minister and a few of the advisors the plan. Then he left. We stayed with the Prime Minister until like 2 o'clock in the morning, and we decided to accept it. All the measures were in the plan. Not all of them were, let's say, most convenient for us. Some of them were quite risky for us, but we decided to take the risk. And following this meeting with the advisors, where the Prime Minister said, okay, we're going for it, I called him to say, we accept. It was late in the morning. Next day, which is Friday, which is Passover Day or Easter, the evening is a high holiday, it's the Seder meal. Aaron Miller, who was the advisor of General Zinni, calls me and he asked me, how late can you or can the Prime Minister do a press conference? I said, well, it's a holiday. The Prime Minister is already in his ranch down south, but I'm sure he can do it very close to when the holiday starts. And of course, the Prime Minister agreed. I go back to Aaron Miller and says, anytime. So Aaron Miller's last words were, okay, I'm going now to Arafat. I'll call you later. He never called. And the answer of Arafat came that evening when a suicide bomber went into Hotel Park in Netanya. Among the festivities, people were sitting along tables with all their families. The suicide bomber detonated himself right there, killing 35 Israelis, injuring more than 100. This is the time where we decided no more we will let or will keep the Palestinians or expect them to stop the terror. We have to be proactive. Hence, Operation Defensive Shield, which started a few days later. And since then, I can tell you, when you go and proactively look for not just the suicide bombers, it is too late to look for a suicide bomber when he already infiltrates your market or your schools. You have to go after the dispatchers, after the planners, after the heads of the terror organizations. And since we became proactive, I can tell you the terror attempts didn't stop. The attempts are still at the same level as they were 2 or 3 or a year ago, but the results are much different. And we have achieved a phenomenal rate of prevention. More than 90% of all terror activities are being prevented. And this is not a small feat. And I can tell you here that although we have probably among the best military and security services, but the real heroes in this campaign, I say, are the Israeli people, because they are the ones who kept sending their kids to school every day, knowing full well that the school buses are the first target for the suicide bombers. Because you see the terrorists, and there's no difference between the terrorists in the Palestinian territory, in Jerusalem, or Tel Aviv, or New York, or Washington, or Madrid, or Moscow or anywhere else. It's the same ideology, unfortunately, right now, of very radical Islam, which was hijacked by a few extremists. And it's the same ideology, the same methodology, the same mode of operations. And the idea is not just to kill people and terrorize, it's also to bring down the economy, and it's also to hurt the very fabric of society, to really hurt the institutions and hurt the sovereignty of the country. So by the Israeli people being strong and resolved, and I would say almost defiant in the face of this terror, it allowed our security forces to reorganize and go up the learning curve and find a way, effective way, to counter the terrorism. And of course, there's no 100% success. It's a very tough, and you have to be on a consistent basis, but at least it keeps the country going. And we're very proud that we kept everything going for the last 3.5 years. The economy, which was suffering a big blow, 12% in GDP was lost in the last 3 years, now is reaching a plateau and moving up. I think this year we'll have the first year in 3 years of a positive growth, 2.5%, maybe even higher. We're moving up in the ratings of Moody's for investments. So any of you have any extra money, I would invest it in Israel now, because the prices are so low, they reached bottom, now they're going to go up. But basically, we persevered. We persevered, and we still are hoping for the Palestinians to come forward and move along a political path. The Palestinians invariably say, well, we cannot stop the terror because you have to offer us some kind of a political horizon, give us some incentive, as if Camp David wasn't incentive enough. Never mind. There came the speech of President Bush, 24th of June 2002, offering them, or the first time that the presidents of the United States spoke about a two-state solution. So we told them, okay. Oh, before that, let me stop there. Sharon kept telling the Palestinians and the entire world, we are ready to make peace and we are ready to make painful concessions. And they told us, that's not clear enough. It's too abstract. What do you mean by painful concessions? That's not good enough. The terror continues. Then came the speech of President Bush with the offer of two-state solution, independent Palestinian state. We told them, okay, now we have some hope or some clear direction. Yes, they say yes, but it's still not good enough, and terror continues. Then came the roadmap, which is very explicitly giving the tools and showing the way how to implement the vision of President Bush, and still terror didn't stop. Then we came to the realization that terror will never stop so long as this leadership, namely Arafat, is there. As long as he controls the finances, as long as he controls the security forces, which are riddled with terror, we cannot move ahead. And we realized that, one, there's no partner, and secondly, we do not want to be seized in this constant bloody bear hug with the Palestinians. We should take control into our own hand, not just militarily, but also a political initiative which would disengage us with the Palestinians. Hence came the disengagement plan of Prime Minister Sharon, which was fully endorsed here by the administration, also by Europe, by the United Nations, and also by Arab countries, Egypt and Jordan, and I hope many will follow. The realization that there is no partner and that we are in this constant bear hug, as I mentioned, brought up this plan. Now this plan calls for, as it is called, disengagement, evacuation of Gaza entirely, some parts of the West Bank, so that the Palestinians and the rest of the world will see that we are doing it in good faith. It's not that we are just trying to dump on Gaza to shore up our control over the West Bank, but to show that there is also a prospect for a continuation. Consolidating our lines, I believe this will bring better security for Israelis, better lives for the Palestinians. We are not happy with this constant friction with the civil population. And I can tell you that there's nothing that Israeli soldiers hate more than standing in checkpoints and looking in stopping ambulances and checking baby carriages. But what choice do you have when they smuggle explosive belts in baby carriages, and they smuggle suiciders posing as nurses or ambulance drivers or doctors? I don't know if you saw the Reuters report. It's on footage of Reuters just a few weeks ago, where they see how ambulances of UNRWA there and Red Crescent are being used to smuggle terrorists. By this disengagement, we will not need these checkpoints. And a central element which allows us to disengage is the fence. By the way, this issue of the fence, which also came into being last year as a result of this terrorism, with all these terrible numbers that I shared with you, was the last resort that we had. And I can tell you here, Israeli government did not want this fence. And pretty much we yielded to public pressure, that they wanted to know that they are protected. Out of 250 attempts of suicide bombing, out of which 126 were successful suicide bombings, all of them, 100% came from the West Bank, none from Gaza. Why? Because Gaza is separated from Israel by a fence. And where you have a fence, they cannot come in. It pretty much boils down to a science. And I can tell you, wherever we have a fence, and since we started, we embarked on this project, and we have the third part of the fence, the northern part is done. No suicide bombing, no infiltrations from where the fence is. Now we're trying to complete it, and we tell the Palestinians, this fence is built by you. You are the architects, because if there is no terror, there is no fence. And this still holds for the future. This fence is certainly not permanent, as Prime Minister Sharon committed and expressed in his letter to the President, 14th of April, just 2 months ago, and it can be taken down in no time. We have had much greater fences in our border with Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt, and they were all removed for peace, so it can easily be removed. So nothing here is permanent, nothing here is prejudging any future political process. So where do we stand now? Well, we keep fighting terror with great success. We also are taking the initiative politically, whereby for the first time we are taking down Israeli settlements, 21 in Gaza, 4 in the West Bank. Now, talking here about it so nonchalantly is very misleading. I can tell you how painful, excruciatingly so, it is for us, for the settlers, Jewish communities, some cases 3 generations. They built a life there. Some cases parents, grandparents are buried there. And they did it very legally. And they were sent there by successive Israeli governments. They really felt like pioneers. For them, it's a painful, painful price. For the Israeli society, it's a very, very painful price. And the decision was not cheered by all quarters of Israeli society. And one of our concerns, of course, is to minimize the friction also within the Israeli societies, and certainly not to have this conflict with the Palestinians spilled over on us or create, God forbid, a situation of a civil war. So we have to do it in a very, very delicate way. And Prime Minister Sharon, if you look at his public declarations and statements, was very consistent from day one when he took office. As I mentioned before, he talked about painful concessions. Then he talked about 2-state solutions. Then he talked about Palestinian state. He talked about end of occupation. And then he is now presiding over an actual evacuation, something that never happened before. The message is very important to the Palestinians and to the Arabs, but also, I would say almost more important, to the Israeli population, to really educate and prepare the public for the real concessions that we have to do for peace. Educating the public for peace. I wish we could see a commensurate effort on the Palestinians, where they would also look at peace as a strategic goal, as an obligation, not just for them, but for the younger generation and future generations. And we don't see that. We see clear incitement from all the media outlets. We see, and this is more dangerous, we see incitement in the curriculum, in the textbooks. And if you poison the heart and minds of 3-year-olds, or first graders, or 12th graders, what does that bode for the future? Hence, in the roadmap, and it's agreed universally by the world community, the Palestinians, to move forward, not only they have to dismantle the terror infrastructure, arrest, collect the illegal weapons, dismantle the hierarchy, fight on a consistent way and sustainable way against the terror, they also have to stop the incitement, stop the hate, and change the curriculum. This is also in the roadmap. But until we will have a leadership over there which is responsible, which is effective, which is trustworthy, which is committed to peace, we are protecting ourselves and still extending our hand in the hope that someone, there will be a leader there, who would also face his own people and look them in the eye and tell them peace is also important for us. And we have also to pay a price for peace. And until that day, we will wait. And we have the stamina, we have the perseverance, and because we know history is on our side, justice is on our side, and I believe the day will come that a peace will be brought about. I am optimistic. I'm optimistic because the people want peace. And look, Israel is a country of 6.5 million, 1 million out of which are Arabs, Palestinians, who have family relations with the Palestinians who live on the other side of the territories. And there are great relations within the country. They enjoy equal opportunities, full rights, they participate in all what life can offer in Israel, and relations are good. Now, these are the same Palestinians on the other side. The difference is the leaders. And I believe there is also a growing realizations in the Palestinians camp that this leadership has not best served. It's an understatement. Their political ambitions and their national interests. And I believe the day will come sooner than we expect, that there will be a new leadership there which will be ready to sit with us and to solve all disputes around the negotiating table. This is what we want to see. I better stop now. I have maybe spoken too much, and I would very much look forward to your questions. Thank you.
The question is, the assertion was that the European governments feel negative about the position which you hold. If that's true, why?
Well, I wouldn't dare explain the European position. I think it's up to the European politicians and diplomats to do. So I would direct the question to them, although I can tell you in the case of the roadmap and the case of the disengagement plan, there were some forthcoming statements. Beyond that, I don't think it's for me to explain, it's for them to explain.
The essence of the question was just stated, and that is, would you explain why you think that the so-called Israeli right would ever agree to a peace settlement?
Yes, in one sentence, because Israel is a country of law, and the rule of law prevails. And what the government, a democratically elected government, has the right to decide, approved by the Knesset, this is what happens. It wasn't easy to evacuate the Sinai, if you recall, following what I mentioned before, the peace treaty with Egypt. And there were many who tried to oppose it violently, chaining themselves into the properties of the communities we had in the Sinai. They were all removed because we are a state of law. And I am very proud of Israel being a pluralistic, whereby everyone can have the right to express his views. We have free press, we have open economy, and of course, everyone is entitled to his views to the extent that they don't hurt others. If somebody would have any racist or anti-Semitic, then he is liable for indictment. But other than that, everyone has his political views, and basically, I told you, it's a state with the rule of law, and whenever action has to be taken by the law and the enforcement authorities, it's being taken.
There's been substantial American financial aid to both Israel and Egypt. How would that work into a Palestinian settlement?
Well, certainly it could be a model. I think that the assistance was invaluable in terms of both Egypt and Israel and the United States' interests. The U.S. now expends about $5 billion a year, which if you look at out of the GNP here, which is what, about close to 11 trillion, it's 1,000th of one promille. It's really worth the investment. Certainly could be a model, not necessarily U.S. I think it's in the best interest of European countries, and here with the gentleman here, to also invest, and other world economies, because stability in the Middle East is the interest not just of Israel or the Palestinians or the United States, is the interest of the entire free world. But this is certainly a model.
There are two questions. Would you comment on the role in the peace process which Mr. Tenet has played, first of all? And then secondly, as we face an enormously difficult problem in Iraq and a difficult future, would you comment upon American policy at this moment, if you can? Or better yet, would you comment on what is needed to be done in Iraq rather than American policy?
Well, yeah, I would be happy to. Certainly, I cannot comment and speak for the United States government, but I can tell you, just from my knowledge about Mr. Tenet's involvement, since most of the problems were security problems with the terrorism, including intelligence, and the U.S. tried to contribute by building capacity for the Palestinians to fight terror. And the director was also involved very much in Camp David before. So he had a lot of knowledge. And I believe the United States saw it as a clear, vital interest to bring about the end of terror and negotiation, peaceful negotiation there. So he will stand there. I think it makes sense. If you ask me, part of, now who to send, it's up to them. But he was very, very instrumental during the Y Agreement Accords, during Camp David, and I guess they wanted to really take advantage of his very intimate knowledge of not just the protagonists in the area, but also of the challenges. And I can tell you he did a fantastic job. But he couldn't just replace the Palestinians in taking the political decision to stop the terror. About Iraq, it's not a matter of distancing ourselves or not. We have said it all along, in the run-up to the war, before the war, and after the war. Iraq is not necessarily an Israeli problem. It's an international problem. It's a regional problem. There were attempts now and before to link the two issues, Iraq and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I say there's nothing further from the truth, the linkage between the two issues. If you recall, before the war, there were some who said, well, the road to Baghdad should go through Jerusalem. Solve this problem. I would say that the problems in the Middle East, the instabilities are rooted in much, much deeper problems, structural problems prevailing in the societies over there. And if you look, the Israeli-Palestinian problem which is so prominently expressed in the media, and basically because of, if I can say here, great PR machine of the Palestinians. But look how many other problems there are during the years. Who remembers now in the 60s the problems in Yemen, Egypt, in Kurdistan with the Kurds. In the 80s, there was a war between Iraq and Iran that cost the lives of 1.5 million. Had nothing to do with the Palestinian problem. Like the Kurds and the Yemens in the 60s had nothing to do with the Palestinian problem. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, had nothing to do with the Palestinian problem. When Syria invaded Lebanon, still occupies Lebanon, has nothing to do with the Palestinians. So the problems are quite, I would say, numerous, aside from the Palestinian issue. Iraq is one of them. Certainly, I don't want to take here, again, any sides, and certainly I'm not capable of speaking for the American administration. But if you ask me, the Middle East, the entire world is much better off today without Saddam in power. And thank you. Thank you. Not only because he brutalized his own people, not only because he destabilized the entire region, but because of the potential, the capability he had to create and produce weapons of mass destruction. I know there is a big thing about it. Whether it was found there or not, it's not quite clear. I can tell you from very reliable intelligence data that there were convoys crossing the borders from Baghdad, from Iraq to Syria, a few weeks before the war, and I can tell you they didn't have flowers there. And it was very sensitive materials, which involved very high-level contacts between Baghdad and Damascus. So the story of weapons of mass destruction is not unfolded yet. Worse than that, Iraq was on the verge of nuclear device back in '81, and also back in '91. And Iraq, unlike other countries, they had the know-how, they had the blueprints. Iraqi scientists know how to make a nuclear bomb. So it was just a matter of time. How much do you think the US could allow having 150,000 troops on Iraq's border to make sure Saddam is kept in check? All this has to be taken into consideration before we judge. But I can tell you, in my view, the world is much better off without Saddam. Not pretty pictures from Iraq, I can tell you that. But I think coalition paid the price. I think the Iraqi people paid the price. But who is exacting this price? It was Saddam Hussein, and his people are exacting the price. And I think that Iraq will stabilize sooner than we think. Why? Because you have a great ally on your side, which is the Iraqi people. And still there are, unfortunately, terrorists there, former loyalists of Saddam, and also this international Al-Qaeda movement, the jihadists who also converge in. But it's certainly my analysis that we are all better off. And it's not an Israeli matter. It's a regional matter. I think all Arab countries are much better off, Gulf and beyond, and certainly the international community.
The first question is, why hasn't Israel done more to publicize the smuggling of arms into Gaza? And then secondly, why isn't there more attention paid to the number of Jewish refugees from Arab lands?
Thank you. I would say, why? Because we do not control the media. We do try to publicize it. Not all of it is accepted or being published. But certainly it doesn't change the facts. And you were right about the tunnels, about the ongoing smuggling. And let me tell you more than that. Since Prime Minister Sharon introduced this disengagement plan, leaving Gaza altogether, there was a step-up of terror campaign from Gaza. Also with the smuggling and with terror activities over there, which resulted in 13 Israeli soldiers who died just 3 weeks ago, resulted in the brutal murder of an Israeli woman, a pregnant woman with 4 of her children that were brutalized and killed in point blank. Yes, we should do more, I can tell you that, but if you can help us, we'll appreciate it. About the issue of the refugees, as I mentioned, the issue of the refugees is not on the table right now because we have to stabilize the situation, but we say it's on the table for negotiations once we have a trustworthy partner. And when we talk about that, the issue of Jewish refugees will also come to the table, certainly. There were, as you mentioned, there were about 850, close to 900,000 Jewish refugees as a result of the Independence War in 1948. There were 470,000 Palestinian refugees. We absorbed all of them, and now they are part and parcel of our society. We would expect the same to happen with the Palestinians. And certainly when the time will come to have an independent Palestinian state, we certainly expect that the refugee problems of the Palestinians will be resolved in the Palestinian state as Israel, as the Jewish state, resolved the Jewish refugee problems within its own borders.
Could a Marshall Plan by the United States be an effective part of a peace settlement?
Yes, it could, but you have to have it after you have a political structure, after you have some kind of a stability and you have commitment by political leaders. You're right. You're right that I would say more affluent people do not go to the streets, but this is not the main problem. Poverty is certainly is bad, but it's not poverty which brings the suicide bombers. It's ideology, and I'll tell you why. If you look at the 50th poorest countries in the world, look at the UN report of which are the poorest countries in the world. Some African countries, Burundi, Eritrea, Bangladesh in Southeast Asia and other countries, they are much poorer than many others, including the Palestinians. Yet you don't see terrorism there. So it's not poverty necessarily that induces the terrorism. It's certainly, clearly the ideology and incitement. So before you pour in money, and I, as a private investor or as a government, before I pour in money, I want to make sure that this money will be well used and not be bombed by suicide bombers. This was the assumption, and this was the situation back in the 90s when we had the Oslo process. Unfortunately, in hindsight, you see what happened with all this money. So certainly, and I'm sure once we have a political structure in place, I'm sure that the money will follow.
If Mr. Arafat resisted his own advisors on a reasonable settlement and has looted the treasury, why does he still survive?
Simply put, terror. Not only terrorizing us, he's terrorizing his own people. So long as he has control of the security forces and special forces to intimidate political opponents, this is the situation. And I can tell you, you will not see any open criticism in the Palestinian Authority, in the Palestinian society. There was one cabinet minister of Arafat who dared criticizing him in public. His name is Nabil Amro. About a year ago, and the same night, his house of this Nabil Amro was sprayed with bullets. You can imagine he shut up. This is my answer.
If Mr. Arafat did want to reach an agreement, does he have an end of violence? Does he have the power to do so?
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned before, when he said that he would need some forces to fight terrorism, we allowed that. And I can tell you, according to the according to the Oslo Accord back in 1993 and the interim accord in 94-95, he was allowed to have 26,000 security forces, 26,000. Then in the Y agreement, 98, he said it's not enough, so we agreed to have 30,000. So we upped it by 4,000. In practicality, he had more than double. There are more than 60,000. We turned a blind eye. We thought, well, maybe he needs it. I can tell you also, we talked about a lot of statistics. Per capita, the Palestinians have more police and security forces than any other people and country in the world. You would think it would be the safest place. But when this supposedly security organizations not only stopping terror but participating, this is the result. So the sheer numbers, as I mentioned, he has about 60,000 people answering to his command. well equipped, with full military gear. If you look at the terror organizations, take jihad, Islamic jihad, at any given time, maybe, and I'm exaggerating, 200 operatives. Look at Hamas, at the most 1,000. So certainly, if he could apply in a focused and in a sustainable way all his assets against those terror organizations, he could round them up, if not in one night, in 3 nights. There are ways to do it.
Wouldn't Mr. Arafat be more effective if he took over social services, which some terrorist organizations control, in order to get more public support? And then secondly, wouldn't a coalition government in Israel help solve the problem?
The first answer to the question is certainly yes. And he had more than $5 billion to do that. He didn't. Certainly, if he would take control over the social network there, he would be much more effective. He didn't. He preferred to have this money someplace else. About coalition government, it's certainly a possibility to have labor join in. We will see how political developments unfold in Israel. You mentioned some antipathy to Sharon. I really deplore it very much. Prime Minister Sharon is a courageous man. He's a dedicated, patriotic Israeli, was a war hero. He was democratically elected. And unfortunately, there was a campaign, a vicious campaign to discredit him. But when you look into the history and you look into the details, you look what he's doing now, what was called by the administration here a bold, courageous, and historic move. I think you can all but appreciate what he's doing. I hope that more people will see it. But certainly there is a possibility. In Israel, I can say, we have a very animated political life, and we're also proud of it. But certainly, the government composition can change.
The statement is 2 major sticking points clearly are the question of the status of Jerusalem and the right of return. Would you comment on those? And are there other outstanding issues as well, sticking points?
Sure, absolutely. Territorial, Jerusalem is one of them. The communities in Judea and Samaria, certainly the issue of the refugees. But what we say, all of it should be resolved in the negotiation. They have their views, we have our views, let's meet halfway. And certainly it can be solved, like a solution was offered in Camp David, which they rejected. But right now, the burning problem right now, the immediate problem right now, is the incitement, is the terror and the violence.
There are so many loose ends, and the issue is so important. And it's been a wonderful evening, and every question has been interesting, and there are hundreds more that could be asked. So I apologize to all of you who still have questions. I'd love to hear them, and I'd love to hear the answers. But we'd like to thank our guests for a marvelous evening.
Thank you very much.